Have you ever wondered what a wild animal feels when someone risks everything to save them? What happened in the heart of the African savannah in 2019 with photographer David Thompson challenges everything science believed it knew about animal behavior. A split-second decision. A helpless cub. And a pack reaction that had never been documented in history. This isn't just a rescue story, it's a scientific discovery that's rewriting the books on animal intelligence. David Thompson wasn't just any photographer. With 15 years documenting wildlife, he had captured images that changed conservation policies in Kenya. His lenses had already recorded births, hunts, migrations, but nothing prepared him for what he was about to experience. Born in a small town in the English countryside, David always felt an inexplicable connection with nature. At 12 years old, he received his first camera and spent hours photographing birds in his backyard. His mother used to joke that he talked more to animals than to people. And perhaps she was right. After graduating in biology from Cambridge University, David decided his life would be dedicated to showing the world the beauty and complexity of wildlife. He believed that through his images, he could awaken in people the same love for nature he had felt since childhood. For years, he faced all kinds of danger: storms in the savannah, hippo attacks, entire nights waiting for the perfect moment to capture rare behavior. But his passion always spoke louder than fear. It was March 2019, dry season in the Masai Mara. The thermometer read 38 degrees Celsius in the shade, and there was no shade for miles. The air vibrated with heat waves that made the landscape dance like water on glass. David had been following a specific pride for 3 days: 5 lionesses and a dominant male that local researchers called King. He was an impressive lion, with a golden mane that seemed to absorb sunlight, and a presence that commanded respect even from other predators in the region. His objective on this expedition was to document hunting patterns during water scarcity. How did lions adapt their strategies when prey concentrated around the few remaining water sources? It was research that could help better understand how climate change affected big cat behavior. David had received a research grant for this project, and the results would be fundamental for future conservation policies. The pride he was following was fascinating. The 5 lionesses had distinct personalities. There was the leader, a majestic female with a characteristic scar above her left eye, the result of a territorial fight years before. Local guides called her Simba Malkia, Lion Queen. She was experienced, calculating, and David had observed how the others always awaited her decision before acting. There was also the youngest of the group, a lioness of barely 3 years who was still learning the complexities of group hunting. And the male, King, who despite appearing lazy most of the time, transformed into a force of nature when his family was threatened. But nature had other plans for that day. The Mara River was more violent than normal. The late January rains, which arrived almost 2 months late due to climate change, created a treacherous current, full of branches and debris dragged from hundreds of kilometers upstream. The water, normally crystal clear, was murky and dangerous. David was adjusting his camera, focusing on a group of zebras cautiously approaching the bank to drink, when he heard a sound that froze his blood. A sharp, desperate whimper. It wasn't the typical call of any animal he knew in his 15 years of experience. It was pure panic, a sound that transcended species, the universal cry of a living being in mortal danger. Through his telephoto lens, he saw a lion cub, no bigger than a house cat, being dragged by the furious current. The little one was struggling, his tiny paws barely managing to keep him on the surface. David estimated the cub was at most 8 weeks old, still dependent on mother's milk, still without fully developed survival instincts. David knew the rules. Every wildlife photographer knows the first commandment: never interfere with nature. It was a fundamental ethical rule, taught in all wildlife photography schools, repeated in all documentaries, engraved in the mind of any serious professional. Nature is cruel, but it's natural. Survival of the fittest, natural selection, the cycles of life and death, all of this is part of a delicate balance that shouldn't be disturbed by human interference. But rules are made for normal moments. And this wasn't normal. The cub had separated from the group, probably trying to drink water alone. as curious cubs often do. David imagined the scene, the little one, thirsty in the scorching heat, approaching the slippery bank. Maybe he slipped, maybe the current was stronger than he imagined. Now, trapped between submerged logs about 15 meters from the shore. Each passing second was one less second of life. David looked around desperately. The Pride was at least 400 meters away, on the other side of the river. Had they heard the call? Were they coming? Through binoculars, he could see some of the lionesses raising their heads, alert. But getting there would take time the cub didn't have. There was no time to find out. David felt something breaking inside him. All the rules, all the professional ethics, all the protocols learned over the years, everything disappeared before those golden eyes full of terror. If I don't do something now, this cub dies. And I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. The decision took 3 seconds. The execution, an eternity. David threw his equipment bag on the ground, $15,000 in professional cameras forgotten in an instant. Inside the bag were lenses he had saved years to buy, a camera body that was his work tool, special filters for wildlife photography, everything abandoned without hesitation. He took off his shoes, feeling the hot sand burn the soles of his feet, and for a moment wondered if he wasn't making the biggest mistake of his life. The Mara River roared like a hungry beast, its dark waters hiding invisible dangers. David knew that crocodiles frequented that region, especially during the dry season when water sources became scarce. He had photographed some of them in previous days, primitive and lethal creatures that could be watching the scene with predatory interest. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the hot, dry air of the savannah, and dove in. The cold water enveloped him like a claw, the thermal shock almost paralyzing his muscles. After hours under the scorching sun, the cold water was like a punch to the stomach. The taste of mud and decomposing vegetation invaded his mouth, mixed with something he preferred not to identify. Each stroke was a battle against a current that seemed to have a life of its own, determined to drag him downstream along with the cub. The distance to the little lion? Just 15 meters. But in the middle of that furious current, it could have been 15 kilometers. David was a good swimmer. He had practiced swimming at university, but this was different from any pool or beach he had ever faced. It was a fight against nature itself. Submerged branches hit his body like invisible fists. Stones rolled under his feet when he tried to find support. And time? Time was running against him. Each second in the water was a second the cub grew weaker, closer to drowning. The current tried to pull him away from the cub, but David swam with a determination he didn't know he possessed. His lungs burned, his arm muscles screamed in pain, but he continued. Something inside him had taken control, a primitive protective instinct that transcended species. When he finally reached the logs where the cub was trapped, David felt something he would never forget, small claws digging into his arm. The cub, instinctively, knew that this strange giant was his salvation. It was as if the little lion understood that this human had risked everything to save him. The cub weighed surprisingly little, maybe 2 kilos at most, but was soaked and trembling violently. David could feel the tiny heart beating rapidly against his chest. The golden eyes, now up close, stared at him with a mixture of fear and inexplicable trust. But getting out of the water would be even harder than getting in. With the cub clutched to his chest, David swam against the current, each movement a test of endurance. His lungs burned as if they were on fire. His muscles screamed for rest. His legs, already tired from days walking through the savannah, felt like lead. But those golden eyes glued to his were fuel enough to continue. The current seemed determined not to let them escape. Several times David felt he would be dragged away, that all the struggle had been in vain. But each time he looked at the cub in his arms, he found strength he didn't know existed. When he finally managed to touch the bottom with his feet and drag himself to the shore, David was completely exhausted. His muscles trembled with fatigue, his lungs fought for air, and for a moment he wondered if he could stand up. The cub, soaked but alive, trembled against his chest, letting out small whimpers that could have been relief. David knelt on the hot sand, feeling the sun quickly dry his soaked clothes. The cub still clung to him, as if knowing he wasn't completely safe yet. And he really wasn't. That's when he heard it. Growls. David raised his eyes and felt the world stop. The entire pride was there. 5 lionesses and the dominant male, arranged in a semicircle, less than 10 meters from him. Their golden eyes shone with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul. It was as if they had appeared out of nowhere, but David knew that big cats could move with ghostly silence when they wanted to. This was the moment that could define him. Hero or victim? For years, David had photographed lions. He knew their behaviors, their signs of aggression, their complex hierarchies. He knew how to recognize when they were relaxed, when they were alert, when they were about to attack. But being there, wet, exhausted, holding one of their cubs, was completely uncharted territory. In all his reading about feline behavior, in all the documentaries he had watched, in all his conversations with wildlife experts, he had never found a precedent for that situation. What does a pride of lions do when they find a human holding one of their cubs? The obvious answer would be, they attack. But there was something different in those eyes. The silence of the savannah was deafening. Not even the wind dared to blow. Even the insects seemed to have stopped buzzing. It was as if all of nature held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. David could feel sweat running down his forehead, mixing with the river water drops still dripping from his hair. His heart beat so loud he was sure the lions could hear it. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready for what? There was no way to run. There was no way to fight. All he could do was trust that his intention, saving the cub, would somehow be understood. The cub let out a weak meow, a call to his family. It was a sound David had heard many times in his recordings, but never so close, never so full of meaning. And that's when something extraordinary happened. The leader lioness, Simba Malkia, the magnificent female with a characteristic scar above her left eye, took a step forward. Then another. And another. David held his breath. Every human instinct screamed for him to run, but he knew any sudden movement could be fatal. Instead, he forced himself to remain still, trying to convey through his posture that he posed no threat. The lioness moved with the typical grace of her species, each step calculated and fluid. David could see every detail of her powerful musculature, every scar that told a story of survival, every mark that spoke of years dominating that territory. She was one of the most lethal creatures on the planet, and she was approaching him. The lioness stopped half a meter from him. Her eyes, now up close, showed no aggression. They showed curiosity, assessment. David tried to read that feline gaze, looking for signs of her intentions. There was something there he had never seen before in his years photographing lions, a kind of recognition, as if she was trying to understand not just what he had done, but why he had done it. And then, the unthinkable happened. The leader lioness slowly lowered her head and, with a delicacy that defied her wild nature, licked David's forehead. A lick. Gentle. Deliberate. Unmistakable. David was petrified. In 15 years photographing wildlife, in hundreds of documentaries watched, in thousands of hours of research on animal behavior, this had never been recorded. Lions don't do this with humans. Large predators don't show affection for a different species. It was something that challenged everything he knew about zoology. The rough tongue carried a warmth that seemed to say, "I know what you did. I understand." It was as if, in that moment, two completely different species had found a common language, the language of compassion. But the surprise was just beginning. The lioness stepped back and made a low sound, not a growl, but a guttural purr. It was a sound David had heard lionesses make with their cubs, a sound of comfort and approval. The other lionesses, who until then had been watching tensely, visibly relaxed. Their tails stopped swishing nervously, their postures became less aggressive. The dominant male, King, who until then had been watching with the intensity of a judge, lowered his head in an expression that could only be interpreted as approval. It was as if the entire pride had reached a silent consensus about what they had witnessed. David gently placed the cub on the ground, his movements slow and deliberate. The little one ran stumbling to his mother, who enveloped him with affectionate licks, checking every inch of his body to make sure he was okay. It was a moment of tenderness David had witnessed many times through his lenses, but never so close, never as an active participant. And that's when something happened that not even the most experienced ethologists could explain. The lionesses positioned themselves in 2 rows, creating a corridor between David and the open savanna. Their bodies relaxed, heads low in a posture that any specialist in feline behavior would recognize as respectful submission. It was as if they were paying honors to him, recognizing his act of courage and compassion. The leader lioness took a few steps toward the savanna, looked back, and let out a low roar, not of threat, but of farewell. It was a sound different from any roar David had recorded before. There was a quality in it that was almost musical. A cadence that suggested complex communication. David stood up slowly, his legs still shaky from both fatigue and emotion. He walked through the corridor formed by the lionesses, feeling dozens of golden eyes following every step. It was as if he was being escorted by honor guards, as if he were a dignitary visiting a royal court. The moment seemed suspended in time. David could feel the heat emanating from the powerful bodies around him, could hear the deep breathing of each animal, could see the respect in their eyes. It was a connection that transcended species, that went beyond any scientific explanation he knew. When he reached the end of the formation, the leader lioness let out one last roar, this time louder, echoing across the savanna like an announcement. The others responded in chorus, creating a wild symphony that David felt reverberate in his bones. It was as if they were communicating to the entire savanna what had happened, marking that moment in the collective memory of the pride. Then, silently, the pride dispersed, taking the saved cub to the safety of the savanna. David stood there, alone, trying to process what he had just experienced. Back in the city, 3 days later, David couldn't stop looking at the images captured by his action camera, which miraculously had continued recording throughout the entire incident. Each frame seemed impossible. Each second, a documented miracle. He had installed the small camera on his chest that morning, a common practice to document his working methods. He never imagined it would record something so extraordinary. The images showed everything: the desperate dive, the cub's rescue, the encounter with the pride, and especially, the leader lioness's lick in the honor corridor. When the video reached the international scientific community, the reaction was immediate and intense. Dr. Mark Bikoff, renowned ethologist from the University of Colorado and author of dozens of books on animal behavior, declared, "This behavior redefines our understanding of emotional cognition in wild felids. We are seeing clear evidence of gratitude, recognition, and ritual, concepts we believed exclusive to higher primates and some cetaceans." Dr. Sarah Bennett, from the Animal Behavior Institute at Oxford, was even more direct in her analysis. "What we see here is interspecific recognition of unprecedented complexity." These lions not only understood the human's altruistic intention but responded with a complex social protocol that suggests a theory of mind much more advanced than we imagined. This is absolutely revolutionary. Professor James Serpell, from the University of Pennsylvania, specialist in human-animal bonds, added, "This video documents something we suspected but had never seen: the capacity of wild big cats to recognize and appropriately respond to interspecific acts of kindness. It's a fascinating window into the animal mind." The video spread through social media like wildfire. In just 1 week, it accumulated over 50 million views across various platforms. Comments in dozens of languages expressed amazement, emotion, and renewed admiration for animal intelligence. Universities worldwide requested copies for research. The behavior was officially categorized as documented interspecific gratitude, the first officially recorded case between humans and wild big cats. Several ethologists initiated studies to try to identify similar behaviors in other species. David found himself at the center of a scientific and media storm. Conferences, interviews, invitations to lectures. Suddenly, the photographer who preferred the solitude of the savannah was under the spotlight of the entire world. 3 years later, in 2022, David returned to the same location in the Masai Mara. He didn't expect to find the same pride. Lions have dynamic territories, families separate, young males are expelled, females migrate. Wildlife is unpredictable, and 3 years is a long time in a lion's life. But on the third day of his new expedition, while documenting a different family of lions, he saw a familiar figure in the distance. A solitary lioness, older, with a characteristic scar above her left eye. Simba Malkia. She watched him for long minutes, the distance maintaining safety for both. David didn't move, just observed through his lenses. Then, slowly, she approached until she was about 20 meters away, close enough for them to recognize each other, distant enough to maintain wild protocol. She sat down, with the typical dignity of a queen, and stayed there, just watching. It was as if she was revisiting a shared memory, as if she wanted to confirm that that extraordinary moment had really happened. David swears that, for a moment, she slightly tilted her head, an almost imperceptible nod, but unmistakable for someone who had lived that unique experience. Coincidence? Imagination of a man who wanted to believe in something greater? Or definitive proof that some bonds transcend species and remain engraved forever in the memory of those who live them? David prefers to believe in the last option. This story reminds us that, even in a world where science explains almost everything, there are still moments that challenge our understanding. Moments that make us question where instinct ends and where something much greater begins, something that connects all forms of life on this planet. David Thompson saved a lion cub on that scorching March day. But perhaps, in that extraordinary encounter in the African savannah, the one who was really saved was himself, saved from the belief that we are merely observers of nature, when in fact we are part of it. Saved from the idea that humans and wild animals are completely separate worlds, when in fact we share much more than we imagine. The video from that day continues to be studied in universities around the world. Each frame is analyzed, each gesture is interpreted, each second is dissected in search of clues about the true nature of animal cognition. But for David, the science behind the event is secondary. What really matters is the certainty that, for a few minutes, two different species managed to understand each other perfectly. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of this entire story, that empathy, compassion, and gratitude are not exclusively human. They exist in forms we are just beginning to understand, waiting only for us to have the courage to recognize them when they manifest. The next time you look into an animal's eyes, whether it's a house cat, a dog, or a lion in a zoo, remember this story. Remember that behind those eyes exists an intelligence, a capacity to feel, and remember that may be much deeper than we imagine. Because, in the end, perhaps the African savannah has much to teach us about what it really means to be human.